When it comes to grammar and grammar instruction, there are three foci you need to constantly keep in view, and those are meaning, form, and use. First, I want to define meaning, form, and use in general, and then I want to look at some concrete examples of how you can incorporate them into your lesson plans. Here you see the three grammar teaching foci. The first one is meaning, and our book lists meaning as semantics, which is really just a fancy synonym for meaning. But what we're talking about is what the grammar itself communicates. Each grammar tense and each grammar point has a reason for its own existence. It communicates something in its own right, and that's something we're going to have to instruct our students. When we talk about form, we're talking about how it is written and spoken. So first we'll be using things like grammar charts or formulas. Anyone who's learned a second language is familiar with these things. A grammar chart would have an infinitive form of the verb at the top and then list all of the different conjugations. And a formula will talk about how a sentence is constructed, and we'll look at some examples of those. Form is also how it is spoken, the pronunciation, and this is particularly important for grammar tenses that use contractions. You can say, I am running, I'm running. We never really say I am going to, at least native speakers don't. They say I'm gonna or I'm gonna. And it's important that you teach that. And then use. Use is the larger picture of how this is communicatively used within a discourse, how and when we use this to communicate within a context. And all three of them are important, but use is going to be one of the hardest and most important things for you to factor into your lesson planning. I want to quickly run through a few concrete examples to give you an idea of what we're talking about. So starting with the present simple, the meaning of this grammar tense is to communicate repetitive actions and current habits. It can also communicate general truths, facts, and beliefs, as well as near future scheduled events. The form, as the name implies, is simple. For the subjects I, you, they, and we, we're going to use the base form of the verb. For the third person, he, she, it, as well as names, we'll put the verb plus S. And in terms of pronunciation, you'd want to push them to be pronouncing that S when it's called for. Now, some ideas for use. How can you present this meaningfully, and how can you ask for your students to communicate meaningfully? You can describe yourself. That would be create a little text or listening where you describe yourself, a friend, a family member, their actions, habits, beliefs. You can discuss personal habits. What do you do every morning, day or night? Your family, members of your family. What's your favorite day of the week? If you communicate, I love Saturdays. On Saturdays, I wake up, I do these things. You can use these to present and then ask the students to communicate these things about themselves. You can become more general. What does a firefighter do? What does a good student do? Even an animal, a dog or a lion, what do they do? And this is going to be a great way to present some new verbs, and you can ask them to do the same about a different animal or about a different profession. Moving on to a little harder, more advanced tense. This would be kind of low intermediate, past, continuous, progressive. The meaning of this is to communicate specific time as interruption, as in at midnight last night I was sleeping. You can also a past action that's interrupted, so you'd use a past simple verb that interrupts a ongoing action. So when you called me, I was sleeping. Also parallel past actions. If you use two verbs in the same past continuous, two things were happening at the same time. I was walking and I was talking on my phone. So the form, I, he, she, it, plus this auxiliary helper verb was, plus the verb ing, or you, they, we, we'll use the helper verb we plus verb ing. Now, unlike with the present continuous, we don't use contractions when we speak this tense, and that would be important. Now, some ideas for use. If you want to teach this tense, how can you present it? Well, what were you doing at specific times yesterday? Sort of discuss different times of the day and what you were doing, and you can, towards the end of the lesson, present them times and ask them to do the same. A personal story is a great way students love when you give personal information or tell a funny or sad or embarrassing story about yourself, and you can do that using several examples of the past continuous. You could also describe your best travel experience, which is a very clear context, and it'd be easy to seed examples like I was swimming in the ocean and the sun was shining. And then you would use those examples to point out the form and the meaning, and then have them write about their own best travel experience using the same tense. To move to a non-tense-based grammar point, adverbs of frequency. The meaning of these is really the meaning of the individual adverbs, the frequency or the lack thereof of actions and habits. We're talking about words like never, rarely, sometimes, frequently, often, always. So the meaning here is basically the meaning of those words, and in that sense this is more a vocabulary focus. But we do need to focus on the form here, which is not just the spelling of those words, it's how they're placed syntactically within a sentence. So there can be pre or post position of the sentence, meaning at the beginning or the end. Often I go to the movies, or I go to the movies often. They're positioned before the verbs. For simple verbs, I often go to the movies. It's important for verbs that have auxiliary helpers, verb tenses, they go between the helper verb and the main verb. You should never give up. I'm always sleeping at 5 a.m. I have often seen him there. Now for use, the ideas are the same as the present simple, but you can communicate these things with more information, how often you do these things. But it can also be used with the past simple and with any other grammar point, as you can see in the form examples. So this is one example of a grammar point that can be dropped into any sort of communicative use. You're just adding this information about the frequency. Similar to that is complex sentences, and if you're not familiar, this doesn't mean generally that the sentences are very complex. This is a technical term, and the meaning is connecting simple sentences via coordinating conjunctions. The 4 coordinating conjunctions, and, so, but, or, and they all have their own use, the meaning that they communicate. The form of this is 2 clauses, a subject, verb, and an object, followed by a comma and one of these conjunctions, and then a subject, verb, and an object. If there is no second subject, no comma is needed, and you don't have a complex sentence. Some ideas for use of this: anything communicative. I put this here because complex sentences are a way to get your learners from the beginning stage, where they're writing simple sentences, towards that more intermediate stage where they're connecting those using these conjunctions. And so you can communicate anything. If you're teaching complex sentences, you can present a reading, an email, a letter, a text about someone famous. You can present a listening using these things that include these and, so, but, or conjunctions. And then you can ask them to write an email or write a letter or write something like that, where you're pushing them to make their sentences longer and complex. And even through a writing process, you can have them write one draft. You see a lot of simple sentences, help them in the second and third draft to connect some of those sentences to make complex sentences. Now some of you may be wondering why I chose to present these foci in this order, starting with meaning and then moving to form and use. For some people, it feels more natural to start with a focus on form, kind of present those grammar formulas or a grammar chart initially. But there's a very important reason I decided to do it in this order, and that's because we as language teachers need to strive to keep meaning in focus throughout our lesson plans. I've seen a lot of novice teachers fall into a trap where they start with a focus on form and then they find it very difficult to break out of that focus. An example would be a prompt that asks a student, write 5 sentences using the present perfect, for example. That's a poor grammar language prompt because we don't create language for the purpose of using a language point. We create language for the purpose of communicating something meaningful. So a much better language prompt would be, write 5 sentences communicating your life experience about travel. You could then add, use the present perfect, but if you've hit all 3 of these foci within that lesson plan, hopefully you won't need to. That's just a bit of practical advice, and hopefully in your future language teaching and grammar instruction, you'll remember to hit all 3 of these foci, meaning, form, and use.